good morning and a warm welcome to all of you. So today we are in day 6 of our 10-day course. I hope all of you have had a restful weekend. Today's lecture topic is on towards a regional energy club. What would it mean? This is the question. It's an important topic from our perspective, that is the Indian perspective. The tutorial will be on the specifics of Eurasia's Caspian reserves and Indian excess. So all the best. Over to you, Professor Shaban.
Thank you very much, Professor Upadhyay, and good morning to all. Have a good week. Today we inaugurate my 6th lecture. Some other people inaugurate something else. And I'm happy to be meeting you again. As a sort of transition from last week, I'd like to emphasize 3 or 4 points very, very briefly. As I try to make clear many times, we are looking in many, many ways at the potential of the Shanghai Cooperation, or the potential of the new Central Asia or the new Asia, in a very much so, as I've said before, in a Weberian approach, using ideal types. What is an ideal type in the Weberian approach? It's sort of a model, not of what exists, but of what could exist or is in the making. And looking at the potential of the Shanghai Cooperation means that we sometimes mention existing facts, or sometimes we mention things that are still in the making. The second point is that we are also looking at what I call real intentions. In other words, what the explanatory factor for the dynamics we're looking at is behind the scenes, or implicitly or potentially. And so on Friday I asked the question, is in fact the ultimate motive behind the Shanghai construction a joint security in the broader sense than military, or in the narrow sense of military? And today I will ask similarly the same question about the energy aspect. Is the ultimate motive, rationale behind the Shanghai construction energy? In other words, the rest would be, as William said, much ado about nothing, or much ado, and the real thing would be energy access, exclusivity, hence the expression an energy club, which is of course to be explained. Third, let me suggest to call the contiguity factor something like affirmative contiguity. Not only contiguity in the geographical sense, but affirmative contiguity, meaning what to do by way of establishing, affirming, strengthening, perhaps to some extent imposing the region or leveling off the region with the rest of the world through the factor of contiguity. So contiguity is, of course, a geographical or a spatial element, but it is very much so, in my mind, part of a geopolitical strategy as such. And to conclude this transition points, we looked at the list of members, observers, and affiliates last week on Friday, and we too briefly mentioned the future membership possibilities. There's also access on the internet to future membership possibilities, or future affiliations in my vocabulary. And if we mention the countries that are in the minds of some observers, some analysts, this is quite striking. As potential observers are mentioned Bangladesh, which makes absolute sense, it's in the region, it's a neighbor, and so on, and Algeria. And Algeria is not contiguous, Algeria is located very far, but incidentally, Algeria is one of the most productive energy exporters by way of natural gas to the south of Europe, to France and to other countries, and it is situated far from the Shanghai Asia, but it is located in a context where there are some alternatives to be found by a country such as Algeria, as there are for a country such as Turkey, alternatives to the classic European dimensions, the classic Western Eurasian dimensions. Potential dialogue partners now, we are mentioned Syria, Israel, Iraq, and Laos. Countries which are more logical in the context of being situated either in Western Eurasia, the Middle East, or in Southeast Asia, of course. Now, future affiliates are not a certain substance, but they are an indication of how things might be going. Today's topic is called why, or towards the original energy club, what would it mean? Or the subtitle, the rephrase, the title could be, why an SCO so-called energy club would amount to more than an Asian OPEP. And the idea implicit in the subtitle that you have already understood is to suggest that the main difference between the situation of the 1970s, the oil shocks, and the situation today is that in the 70s, the producers started organizing themselves to rise prices and so on, but they were exporters overseas to the consumers. Whereas in this case, in particular in the New Asia, we have producers and consumers who are contiguous. So they are neighbors. There is not this overseas transport factor is not present. We'll pick this up in the conclusion and in the tutorial. So to introduce even further the topic of today, what is the real purpose? What is the real intention of the new Asia? I ask the question again today for energy, as I did on Friday for other reasons. And if the real purpose is what we're looking at today, the real purpose matters more than clarifying what the real nature of the construction is. What is the ultimate geopolitical strategic aim or motive of the countries concerned? The hypothesis of this session today is the following one. The hypothesis is that all that has been made or suggested as prominent until now, the border settlements, the border negotiations, the good neighborhood, the cross-border improvements, the enlargements of the affiliation and the deepening and so on, boil down to one purpose. The one purpose as the major geostrategic gain to ensure the new region with energy independence, with energy capacities to serve oneself. In other words, the conceptual approach, might it be such that it should yield to a more realist or real or concrete reality, which is classically to cast off dependencies of all kinds, neo-dependencies of all kinds, in particular in terms of energy, and to emerge or re-emerge or neo-emerge as a center which is both a center in the classic geopolitical sense, but also a center independent in terms of its energy, energy being the fuel, so to speak, and the substance of development and economic growth. So in other words, could it be the case that we would, purely looking at energy issues, have the key, the explanatory factor of the whole process that has been taking place over the past 30 years, or potentially even more than 30 years, starting from the attempts to stabilize the border situation in the late 70s. I present my material in 4 paragraphs, which are on the board. Paragraphs 1 and 2, so to speak, look at the offer, the topic of the offer, and paragraphs 3 and 4 are the topic of the demand for energy, offer of energy and demand for energy. Looking or trying to look at qualitative aspects, quantitative aspects, and mixing the two to finish in paragraph 4 with a strategic question, which is on the whiteboard, on the screen. So what is, in paragraph 1, the starting point or the quantitative aspects of the SCO energy questions, or the Shanghai energy questions, not strictly restricting ourselves to the members, but looking at the countries concerned in the region. The question is, from a starting quantitative point of view, that those countries have most of the world's reserves of energy to date. Now, to be specific, one should have numerous and up-to-date figures which keep changing to specify what we call reserves, and in fact, not just one category of figures, but 4. We should be able to distinguish between estimated reserves. Now, estimated reserves of energy are what archaeologists or geologists rather and engineers tell us what could be lying on the ground by way of oil, gas, and coal, and so on. The estimated reserves are just one indicator. not sufficient, but a starting point. The second indicator we should be able to document, sometimes with difficulty, is the one of proven reserves. Proven reserves is what engineers more specifically confirm as existing energy reserves, and even they go so far as to suggest that the energy is available there in a form which is exploitable, not made so difficult to access as in the case of Turkey, for example, that the plateau lying on top of the reserve is such that it is difficult to imagine ever drilling through it. The third category of indicators which we should provide, and not easy to access sometimes, is the figure of exploited reserves. That is, reserves that are tapped, reserves into which one has equipped, what do you call them, wells and the all engineering extracting technology. But that is not enough still. The fourth indicator is the indicator of profitable reserves. In other words, reserves which make sense to extract and sell when the market prices are such or such, and not extract and export when the world market prices are too low. So we have a situation with numerous changing, evolving factors that are to be taken into consideration, and we ought to simplify the picture when we look at broad analysis of the situation. Roughly speaking, it is possible to say that the region holds half of the world's gas reserves, 50 to 55% of the world's gas reserves. And by the countries, I definitely mean more than the 5 countries usually mentioned. We have to include, of course, Azerbaijan and Iran and Russia and all countries that are in the Shanghai Cooperation as affiliates. 50 to 55% of the world's reserves for gas, the main producers being Turkmenistan, of course, and Russia, to a larger extent than usually is known by analysts and observers and students. But it is the case also that energy is available in countries little spoken of, such as Afghanistan and others. When we come to oil, we have 2 things to mention. Not only does the region hold 1/4, at least, of the world's oil reserves, 25% more or less, but it has an additional asset, which is access to the open sea through Iran. And so the question of oil directly, in terms of being exportable, so to speak, and the question of gas indirectly, exported through other routes, also comes to mind. The asset for the Shanghai affiliate is not only the reserves, but the exportability, so to speak, or the transportability of the reserves. When we come to coal now, the region holds about 1/3 or 35% of the world's reserves. And I'll finish on the thing, and then we'll come to more updated figures, thanks to my excellent colleague, Professor Guzer. Uranium is in particular something that should be borne in mind, where the region holds not only half of the reserves, but half of the produced uranium. Kazakhstan itself having a share in the world production of uranium of 40%, and an estimated 15% of the world's uranium reserves, uranium being, of course, the energy of the nuclear reactors, with a specific issue here that those countries of Central Asia are signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty of Semipalatinsk of 2006, so they are, in a sense, try to detach themselves from atomic questions, certainly in the military sense, but also as much as possible in the civil sense. But yet, of course, there is a counter trend which has picked up since 2006 in the region, which is to suggest that nuclear energy production for civil use is unavoidable, or an option to be really well considered as such, and that trend is affecting Kazakhstan, which is in the process of contemplating building nuclear reactors, and even Mongolia. And I heard recently, I think India is of course in the same direction, uranium being an alternative to problems of energy production or imports and so on. So we have a situation where indeed the region has, at least potentially, at least a competitive capacity to produce energy in terms of other well-known rich producing areas in the world. So when we look at more contemporary figures, we can briefly, and you will notice that the figures are sometimes dating. This is recent, 2020, but even tables going back 5-10 years are relevant because energy reserves haven't changed that much. They are part of geology, so they are there. What has changed is the scientific knowledge of where they are and the availability or the accessibility which they might offer. So we look at the first line, which is Kazakhstan, very prominent among the 5 countries in terms of oil production. But of course, the table should also consider Azerbaijan and Iran, and of course Russia. So gas, we have Turkmenistan very prominent there. The figures mean things to experts. To the layman, trillions of millions of billions of barrels or cubic meters is not so much explicit. Coal again puts Kazakhstan in top position. Hydroelectric energy logically indicates that Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, the 2 upstream countries of the region, are extremely capable of producing energy. In the south of the region, Kazakhstan, the figures indicated concern more the north of the country with great rivers such as the Irtysh and other rivers are concerned. Solar energy as a potential, of course, places this country, especially Kazakhstan. Why Kazakhstan? Because it is larger in size, therefore more able to allocate land to the technology. And the wind potential is, of course, extremely high as well. For solar energy and wind energy, we have the same problem in countries such as Kazakhstan as in Mongolia. That is, the obvious potential is there. There is no questioning about the fact that the countries could or are able to provide a huge amount of energy from wind and sun, but the climatic conditions are such that the maintenance cost for the equipment is extremely high, because the winters and summers have a temperature gradient of 80 degrees, from -40 to +40 degrees. So even resistant metals suffer a lot. The same applies to roads, actually, which have to be rebuilt almost every year. So we are into a vague area of potential numbers or indicative numbers, but we are in a very clear area of the potential productivity in terms of energy of the member states. And depending on your area of expertise, but even intuitively, taking into account the countries mentioned, they are all, to some extent, energy-rich holders or potential producers, except in the case of countries which are also producers but not self-sufficient. They are countries that are net importers, which either have no choice but to import massively, or also made to import because the energy imported is of a better quality than the energy self-produced. China and India in particular are producers, but also massive importers for that reason. China has coal, but of a lesser quality than imported coal, and China, of course, is developing wind energy and solar energy, but is in dire need of importing energy. It is estimated that the energy import needs of China increase by 5% every year. Now, 5% every year after 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years is a huge number. And I'd be happy in the tutorial to hear the figure for India. Probably there is a figure somewhere, how many percent each year extra energy India needs to import. We could mention resources which are not energy, but clearly industrially relevant. The country holds a huge amount of the gold reserves, especially in countries such as Mongolia and Kazakhstan, and other rare metals. And Kazakhstan, as they like to boast, holds and can produce and export all the elements of the Mendeleev table. They have everything. That's how they introduce themselves. First their name, then the family name, and then the Mendeleev table. So this is a picture which is definitely part of the new geopolitical actor of Central Asia, and part of the great game, but not the great game as sometimes we think there is a sort of high, massive diplomatic / military dominant reality in the world. Energy aspects and industrial aspects and mineral aspects are, of course, very prominent. Paragraph 2 now, looking in a more qualitative, so to speak, manner at the question of energy plus the question of the contiguity of the countries concerned. There are perhaps 2 or 3 things to be underlined, indicated by A, B, and C on the board. First of all, in terms of energy needs are not purely related to population, but they are also related to population. And the region has gone from holding the Shanghai Cooperation Organization members, have gone on from hosting 25% of the world population to today 50 to 60% of the world population after the accession of India and Pakistan. In other words, 2/3 of the world's population live there, and 2/3 of the world population have to be housed, serviced, educated, and so on, or transported. And so the figure is dazzling in terms of being immediately to be put in perspective with the energy reserves. However high the reserves are, however efficient or quantitatively speaking impressive the production of energy is, the needs are also exponentially expanding, because not only is this a high population, but it is a population which is young, which is growing in needs in countries which are industrializing very quickly. China, of course, India as well, and also the post-Soviet reconstructive states of Central Asia, and so on. So however classic the demographic factor is, it is definitely relevant. And beyond the figures of today's population, we ought to look at what you could name in English population pyramids, or the sort of age groups as well. Young populations have a faster growing needs for energy than, to some extent, older populations. The second factor, B, territory. Thank you. Is the fact that the territory is not only large but contiguous. I've indicated this many times to you, perhaps ad nauseam, but still we ought to take it into consideration. The territorial size of the Shanghai Cooperation partners is 3/5 of Eurasia, and is one that is almost automatically put forth very early on in presenting or defining the region. 3/5 of the Eurasian landmass, of course, is relevant, similarly as the absolute figures of population are relevant. But as I've said many times, this is also a contiguous territory, which is the case of most regions. Of course, regions, if I'm coherent, are the partnership established among neighbors. Their neighbors are by definition contiguous, at least in the majority of them. I explained to you as a half joke that Greece became contiguous to the European Union in 2007. And in case of the SCO affiliates, of course, countries such as Algeria are not contiguous. They're situated very far away, if they ever become observers. But here we have a contiguity which makes sense, because not only does the region comprise, according to some lists, the majority of the 17 or whatever, 20 highest producers or reserve holders of energy. So most of the potentially highest reserves of energy are there, but they are there among countries which are contiguous and which are, with some exceptions, neighbors, in the sense that energy transportation is not so difficult. Transportation is difficult directly from Russia to China for reasons to do with geomorphology and the mountain ranges of the mountains of Western Mongolia and northeastern Kazakhstan, but they are easier enough to transport from Russia to China via Kazakhstan, for example. Very easy to transport across Iran and easy enough to transport basically from the west of the continent, Western Eurasia, to the east of the continent, Eastern Eurasia. With the exception, of course, of land imports into India, which we will mention in the tutorial, and with other exceptions which make the south of Central Asia and the area around Afghanistan difficult for geomorphological reasons. But there are two aspects to be considered here, and one which I will pick up in a later paragraph. One aspect is the energy transportation among member states or among SCO affiliates, and the other question is the question of energy transportation beyond the common space of the SCO affiliates. To make a not so long, but to make a longer story short, the idea is the following. The idea is that the investments necessary in terms of financing, the investments that are necessary to equip the continent with pipelines for gas and coal is such that the countries concerned either have a reluctance to devote so much money to the construction of thousands of kilometers of pipelines, or strategically speaking, find it convenient to share the cost with countries situated outside the SCO space, so to speak, but which are, of course, extremely high importers of energy, such as Japan, South Korea, in the east, and other countries in the west. And so the dynamic at play is one by which pipelines will be constructed or are being constructed to connect SCO affiliates among themselves, but also able to be continued and prolonged to those countries. But how does one reach Japan, South Korea with pipelines is a very difficult question, because there is either the sea to cross, the sea sometimes called Sea of Japan, which the Koreans call the Eastern Sea, Donghae, and for reasons we could go into. And how does one reach South Korea, which is, of course, an island in the sense of being separated from the continent by North Korea, is a very throbbing headache. But the question is being addressed, and to some extent resolved, I don't know, because part of it is part of the state's not secretive, but sort of discrete negotiations. But my point is that so many would-be difficult or impossible questions are in fact being addressed and solved to a large extent. For example, the question of crossing through the territory of Mongolia, which for some time was a difficult one, because neither Russia nor China wanted to depend on the Mongolians on the territory for imports or exports, is being now addressed with some degree of north-south pipeline construction. The main problem, which is for Mongolia the east-west connection, almost no rail connection east to west as against north to south, is also being addressed, because east-west connections across Mongolia would certainly make Kazakhstan or territories of the center of the continent, not closer in kilometers, but accessible by pipelines going east of Mongolia, which is towards South Korea and Japan. So all these issues are being addressed, and in the name of energy transportation efficiency, or in the name of cooperative regional dynamics, whatever you prefer to call it, these issues of the engineering of the construction of pipelines across, I repeat, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 kilometers is one that is at present being addressed, which wasn't addressed 10 years ago, which wasn't addressed 20 years ago, and which was something that would have shocked people even to be mentioned 30 years ago. The distance is one from Turkmenistan, Iran, and Azerbaijan, from the Caspian Sea to the east of the continent, because in terms of China, at least originally, the highest consuming regions of China are east and southeast. So this distance is what is the reference we have in mind, even if, of course, the distance is smaller from other among other countries. And the last point C, is that this also is a relevant issue: energy production, energy transportation, meeting energy needs due to the population and due to the territorial factor. These are all relevant in terms of the diplomatic framework we are looking at, which is the SCO Charter of 2002. The Charter clearly underlines that part of membership, part of being a member of the organization officially, and my additional comment, indirectly or informally, part of being an affiliate in general, observer, and even a dialogue partner, but certainly the consequence of membership is a commitment. The word is an easier topic. A commitment to privileging cooperation with other member states over cooperation with what the Mongolians call third neighbors or partners outside the region. Any member and would-be applicant should have a common border with an SCO member or an SCO affiliate, but also commit itself to privileging cooperations among other affiliates over cooperation with other countries in the world. And that is an extremely clear and interesting point to be mentioned in this paragraph too, and to sum up the approach so far, in the sense that privileging cooperation, energy cooperation with other affiliates means something quite clear. It means potentially, at least, to reorient energy exports to fellow members or affiliates, and redirect exports possibly away from a country situated outside the Shanghai space, and politically or diplomatically or historically or potentially this is the case. The reason why it's not yet perhaps a reality is because those countries still need the revenue from exporting energy outside the Shanghai space to countries which are ready sometimes to buy energy at a higher price. And so those countries are not yet ready or willing to deprive themselves of the revenue derived from exporting outside the Shanghai zone. But potentially the concept of an energy club is beginning to make sense. Not only is it officially mentioned by some SCO members, there is something called an SCO energy club, which is more or less successful, more or less exclusive, more or less well accepted, but the concept exists exactly as the concept of a SCO currency zone. And if one day should come into reality, that would be an extremely sudden sort of revelation of the original motive for planning the Shanghai construction in a sense. So my conclusion here is to suggest that we ought to ask ourselves the question of whether the chicken and the egg again, the original intention, maybe as far back as the 1980s or 70s, I mean, going back many years before the official launch of 81, 85, 81 of the process, was to facilitate or to build a new post-Soviet or post-something Asia, almost automatically capable of solving the energy question for itself. In other words, if the hypothesis holds, as early as the 80s and 70s, the idea in the mind of some leaders was to equip the region one day with the possibility of being independent from energy exports from outside the region. And the rest is the means to the end. The means being opening borders, negotiating borders, stabilizing borders, establishing an organization, mobilizing diplomacy and international law and other forms of legal legal umbrellas or frameworks to consolidate the cooperation in general and energy cooperation in particular. And this hypothesis, to me, is a stronger one than the other one. The other one being that de facto something was done in 1991 and 1996, border stabilization. Suddenly things worked out, negotiations went well, border agreements were signed, everybody understood and practiced good neighborhood. And so somebody one day said, oh, we are good neighbors now. So what about energy? What about currency? What about investment? So on. In other words, the existing means of the institutions produced the later awareness that there could be an ambition to cooperate in delicate areas such as energy. It's an open question which I keep to us, but we could suggest for the tutorial that you have in mind such dynamics as the post, for example, 2008 international economic crisis, which led to decisions among SCO members to create their own economic, financial, banking arrangements to become less dependent on the world financial institutions which had failed. Hence the Asian Development Bank and similar creations, which were perceived not only as a properly Asian reaction or solution, but as a competition or as an alternative to world financial institutions. Now, for paragraphs 3 and 4, which I've called the demand aspect, although this offer and demand dichotomy is not absolutely relevant, is the quantitative aspect, again, of the energy question in the name of good neighborhood. There are all other complementary qualitative aspects of the question, which are the following ones covered in a few minutes. What can we say more about the qualitative energy aspects, renaming them the good neighborhood aspects or the good energy neighborhood aspects? From the point of view of the demand, it is estimated that these years the region will amount to 20% of the world energy demand, which is a very high proportion and a growing one as well. This leads me to the idea that the main awareness of present SCO members or present activist SCO affiliates is not a great game in the sense of a diplomatic, would-be military great game, but a priority which has to do with an energy great game. In fact, energy great game is a sort of a summary of my previous paragraph. There are energy great games in the plural taking place, and we can, and I've just done so in my introduction today, suggest that these energy great games are the key element to what seems to be territorial great games or territorial gains as great games. My contention here is that, as you've already understood, that if we look at the list of new members, new observers, new affiliates, with some, of course, highly diplomatic or historical exceptions, are all countries or territories relevant for energy production or energy transportation or energy connectivity. One thing is the reserves of energy, which we've mentioned. The other thing, and perhaps mainly so in terms of geopolitics, is the capacity to import, contiguously speaking, or bypass obstacles to importations. And here I think the case of India and Iran is absolutely not just relevant, but fascinating in the sense that if I rephrase the question in a very classic geopolitical way, the links between India and Iran, situated not very far in terms of kilometers by way of the whole region, the links are a way to bypass the land obstacle which is the territory of Pakistan at present, but also a further reason why Iran would have been a desired new member in the organization. I think there was a moment when 10, 15 years ago, in many, many ways, Iran was I've said before, a very eager applicant to the organization from the point of view of Iran. From the point of view of the organization, Iran was a very welcome actor because there were years when Iran was a sort of very activist, a critical voice against the West. And so indirectly, Iran was, 10, 15 years ago, a country which expressed openly what some STO members might have thought secretly or discreetly. But this is superseded today, I think, by the relevance of the territory of Iran in connecting Central Asia or the New Asia to the Middle East and the West, of course for exports and imports in general, but for energy imports and exports in particular. And so we discussed this issue last October. I don't want to be too long over this issue, but the connectivity from India in terms of energy imports is quite clear. It's the Middle East and Saudi Arabia, or it's Iran, or even if experts tell us that the territory of Iran is not yet equipped enough by way of land, railway transportations, or roads, for example, to really be in a facilitated corridor of transportations from the south of the country, which is the coast line, north to the Caspian Sea area, and eventually to and from Russia. But the fact that the territory of Iran, which I take only as one example, seems, quote unquote, to make more sense, to have more relevance for energy transportation than even for other, from other points of view, is a case in point. When we look at figures, we realize not only at the fact that the major actors of the New Asia, which are China and India, are energy-dependent countries, but we look at a situation where the main solution to the energy problems is imports from within the organization, with India having more choice, more open choices beyond the Shanghai Organization as such. But when we look at the Middle East countries from which India imports, they have all or are all becoming affiliates to the organization. So there is an interesting discussion which we will have as to the fact that whether or not the SCO affiliation is an additional facilitator to energy imports, additional to other good diplomatic relations which make countries producing energy happy to export to countries needed to import energy. I prefer to remain on the qualitative aspect here than to go into some figures. But to conclude paragraph 3, and before I come to the main discussion in paragraph 4, let me just say that we have a situation regarding energy which is first of all fast changing and fast evolving. When you look at the situation 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there was much more compartmentalization between countries such as, for example, Turkmenistan, Iran, Russia, which were high producers but not as connected to the consumers, the consumer countries, and a situation where it is to the necessary to at least try to establish a hierarchy of factors and of factors or reasons why countries opt for such or such diplomatic realignment or clarification. And the discussion point is whether energy questions as suggested today come on top of the priority list compared to other factors that we've mentioned. In other words, my last word on paragraph 3, in the name of or in the interest of energy questions, are countries prepared to overcome or bypass or leave to the side their there are other factors of disagreement. Would energy agreement take over territorial and or other form of international disagreement? Now, to mention paragraph 4, which is called the strategic head-to-head scenario or hypothesis, I will mention the concept used by a French scholar, Jean-Louis Domnac, many years ago. In fact, very early in the post-Cold War times of the early 1990s, and the discussion of his suggestion. But also here I'm echoing one point I made in chapter 5 on Friday, which is the defiance. The fact that from the point of view of the military capacity, is there a trend which would suggest that countries that become very strong, impressive in terms of the military capacity are tempted to overuse that capacity and become either defiant or threatening or overusing their military deterrence capacity. The same applies to the energy question and more generally to the macroeconomic success. When countries become rich, prosperous, developed and so on, able to make others dependent upon them, they might be tempted also to overuse that power and establish a hard way of talking to the other countries that have become dependent. Now, what is Jean-Luc Domnac's hypothesis, if I translate from the French, is the following. The hypothesis, which is in French here, sorry I forgot to put it in English or Hindi, is the following one. Would a country be tempted to open up in order to become rich or prosperous through trade, later to close in again to develop by itself or with the neighbors, is my additional term to Mr. Domnac's suggestion. So I repeat, would a country be tempted to open up, the expression precisely used for China in 1978, in order to become rich and prosperous from the revenue of international trade, revenue of other types of exchanges, international trade as theorized by David Ricardo and so on, and then eventually one day to decide to close in and enjoy the richness, enjoy the currencies, enjoy the bank reserves, and just finance its own development. Now, at the time of the early 30s, this is a chapter in a book written in 1993, at the time Domnac did have in mind China per se, closing in as China. My hypothesis today is that no country would close in by itself, but possibly close in with neighbors. So you've understood what I mean. The idea is that would the SCO Asia, whether the members or the affiliates, open up and trade and import, export, and become very rich and prosperous, and one day become more exclusive, more of a club. The word club suggests exclusivity, and enjoy the development of themselves at the expense of development of other countries in the world. So these new dialectics of opening and closing in, I think, should be taken into consideration. The issue of opening up and becoming prosperous exists in history. This is exactly the way in which Japan became prosperous in the late 19th century. The Meiji era suggesting to opening up to the key partners at the time, which were England and the USA, becoming very rich and able to buy military equipment. And then in the late 19th century and early 20th century, Japan embarking upon the expansionist story as we know it. But opening up to become rich is also something that has characterized Korea in history and other countries which cannot become really developed or prosperous if they remain closed. Now, the issue of opening up to the foreigners means something quite specific to the Koreans, the Japanese and others. But is an issue which concerns us all. So the hypothesis that Mr. Domnac is suggesting to us should be perhaps kept in mind or picked up and modernized, of course, in the present years, but one clearly relevant for the discussion, of course, with its limitations. Because what does it mean to open up and become prosperous and then eventually one day to close in? It means two things. Not only does it mean to become defiant or neglecting or distant from the rest of the world, but it means to do so at a time when the region that would close in is able to sustain itself without the rest of the world. And this is not yet the case, not only because theorists and economists tell us that without international trade, progress and development is slowed down, that countries need free trade or at least open trade in order to maximize their resources and development capacities. But it means also that a region such as the new Asia that would close in terms of energy exports would deprive itself of the revenue derived from the energy exports to the rest of the world. And as I understand, this is not yet the case, that in macroeconomic or macro-financial terms, the countries we have in mind are not able to do away or do without the energy derived from energy exports. But this is how the question is phrased to you this morning and how we can discuss it. We could, if we have in the room OPEP experts, they can tell us to what extent OPEP countries, at least those in the Middle East, might be prepared to focus more and more on exports to new Asian countries, by contrast to exports to so-called Western countries, or whether this is ever impossible, or whether this is something that is being considered, or that will never happen because the issue of international energy trade revenue is the one that I've mentioned, and so on. Now, to conclude, so to speak, on paragraph 4, let me mention something else, which is a term that I haven't used yet, and that is called sometimes the energy or the oil peak. The energy peak or the oil peak. That is to say, the date until which oil is being extracted and produced and sold and consumed and used, and the date after which oil will basically run out, not in geological terms, but in terms of profitability, and having to be replaced by other forms of energy. Now, the year of the oil peak, I think, is being pushed back all the time. There was a time, I think, when the oil peak was mentioned as something relevant for the 2030s, 40s. Now, the date, I think, is 2050. And it's probably going to be pushed back because new techniques of extracting oil by fracking or other forms of techniques are being developed. But that is one reference point which we can have in mind. If the oil peak is 1950, we have 25 years to study it. The question: if the oil peak is closer in time, we have to shift our analysis earlier. Or if the oil peak, the fossil energy peak is pushed back in time, then we have a number of decades in the name during which to study the question. I think there are signs of things changing very much in the world in terms of energy production, imports, exports, and in particular oil. The hierarchy of oil exports and imports. I'm struck by the fact, for example, that over 10 years ago, the USA, which for 100 years had a policy of security policy of importing energy, importing oil massively, to the point of making the points of access or deliveries of oil in the world questions of national security. And national security is something in the name of which any country is prepared to go to war, has become a net producer, reducing massively its energy imports, especially oil, and developing the putting to extraction of oil reserves in the USA territory, or developing new ones by fracking and other forms of technologies. Now, at the same time as this has happened, in other words, a re-Americanization of the energy production question, at that exact same moment in history, key providers of energy to the USA have somehow rethought or balanced out their diplomacies. Some of them have re-Asianized and so on. So there is, in my analysis, I'm not saying I'm right, I'm just saying I'm freely suggesting as an academic that we have a parallel evolution where some key countries, such as the USA and others, are rethinking their energy import policy at the same time as their providers of energy are themselves rethinking their diplomacy and rethinking their alliances in the world. This is all linked to the fact that something very simple and non-negotiable is energy dependence or energy independence, because energy holds the keys to industrial development and societal peace. So in conclusion, and questions that I would like to suggest to you and to us are the following 2 points. The remaining question when we discuss energy is nuclear energy, which is particular in many, many ways, because it is a much more efficient form of energy. I'm sure that scientists can explain to us how many tons of oil or cubic meters of gas 1 kilo of uranium is equivalent to, but by efficient I mean with a quantity of nuclear fuel, the energy produced is equivalent to vast amounts of oil and gas and coal, with a specific issue regarding the nuclear energy. One is its link, its potential link to the nuclear military dimension, and the other is, of course, the access to uranium as a fuel and what to do with nuclear wastes. And so in that sense, there is also an asset for the New Asia, or New Extended Central Asia, as I call it, because it has it has nuclear reserves. I've mentioned those of Kazakhstan, but other countries as well. They have the space to deal with their nuclear wastes in many, many ways, the space that other regions, Europe, for example, doesn't have. And it has the capacity to equip. This is the asset of nuclear energy. It can be produced in locations which can be dispersed, and therefore the issue of energy, electric energy transportation, is less of a headache than when energy is produced in a more centralized location. So the nuclear factor is also an additional factor or advantage for the region we're looking at, in addition to the reserves of oil, gas, and coal, and so on, that I've mentioned. The other question is, what might be the reaction to an energy club of the SCO or affiliates, the reaction by other groupings of producers and consumers, notably the OPEP and the Western consumers of energy, especially Europeans, because the Americans have energy at their disposal, whether in the USA or in Canada or in Venezuela or other countries of the continent. What would be the reaction of non-Middle Eastern OPEP countries, or the reaction of clients of the OPEP, should the scenario of a SCO energy club pick up and become the reality in the world? I do not know, but as part of our analysis of the situation, we should also anticipate and discuss 2 or 3 or possibly more hypotheses or scenarios of what I call the reaction to the possibility of an SCO energy club being formed, being efficiently formed, becoming exclusive, or becoming defiant. In other words, the day when, this is a science fiction option or a hypothetical question, the day when energy produced within the Shanghai zone would remain within the Shanghai zone and benefit the countries in the region. So many questions for the discussion after tea at 11:29.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your...
I think you wanted the pipeline ones. I had them.
And I'm happy to leave these documents on the table for students to look at during the tea break, especially this one, which is a bit old now, but it's called the 17 countries sitting on the top energy reserves in the world, and you'll have surprises in that list when you come to look at it. You have figures, detailed figures for India in particular and other countries, so please come and look at this. This is the same as the, but this is for nuclear energy, and this is something on the SCO concept of the club, written by 2 colleagues, Vitaly Bushoyev and Valery Pervuhin, quite relevant, despite the fact of being written some years ago. And my colleagues' excellent documentation here. Yes. And so let's approach the topic of the specifics of Eurasia's Caspian reserves and Indian access for a few minutes with me speaking, and then take questions from the floor. Questions restricted to and focusing on the topic of the day. And while I speak, there will be a map put on the white screen on the screen, so we can visually accompany what I'm supposed to say. I wish to make 4 points. Briefly, what's wrong? The first point is the mention of the concept of the Caspian Basin, the Caspian Sea area, or the Caspian area, whichever you prefer to call it. And there is a famous chapter of geopolitical analysis which focuses on basins, river basins in particular. So the concept of a basin is also one that is used and present in geopolitics. The Caspian Sea area, the Caspian Sea basin, as we can see on the map if you zoom in to some extent, is the... Or maybe you find some other maps, I don't know, but yes. Maps being interpretations more than representations, as we know.
So you can just continue to
is a basin with which you are familiar, but with a map we can see more clearly who is part of it immediately on the shores and who is out of it. Incidentally, the Caspian Sea itself was the object 5-6 years ago of an agreement, finally an agreement that took 10 years to materialize among the countries that are maritime neighbors around it, and they agreed finally on the status of the Caspian Sea as a sea, I think, and not as a lake or vice versa. The issue being precisely that if it is a sea, there is an international water zone in the middle of it, and if it is a lake, there isn't. So there is a Caspian geopolitics as such, which mobilizes very actively the countries around it, because it made a change, of course, 30 years ago, is that the country, the Caspian Sea neighborhood has gone from 2 countries, Iran and the USSR, to all countries around, Azerbaijan, Russia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Iran. So it's become a complex zone in itself.
This is visible. You can see the Caspian Sea around there.
Yes. No better map. No. So the point here is to suggest a word which is presumably too strong, but which is useful for discussion, that the Caspian Basin's sort of monopoly or dominance or centrality is indisputable. It is indisputable, that's my contention, that the Caspian Sea holds the energy keys, the energy reserves of the years to come, maybe the decades to come. Depending on the indicators, of course, the Middle East is still, the Gulf area is still the first producer in the world, but there are, in terms of reserves and potentials and contiguity and strategic use and geopolitical construction, something to be said about the Caspian Sea, with Azerbaijan, Iran, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Russia, some of the major producers of energy in the world. Now, a recent fact has happened, which should be taken into very serious consideration. That is the halting or the delaying of the pipeline link between Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan. That link, which is going west in a sense, would have connected Turkmenistan and the east of the Caspian Sea, which is the reasons the countries I have mentioned, to Azerbaijan, and from Azerbaijan to the Mediterranean through the Tbilisi, Baku-Tbilisi, Ceyhan pipeline I've mentioned before. The construction of the undersea pipeline from Turkmenistan to Azerbaijan was halted, and so this marks to a large significant extent the Easternization or the Shanghaization, so to speak, of the reserves of the Caspian Sea, to be destined to remain south and east of the Caspian Sea and not to be mainly exported west. So the Caspian Sea as a concept makes sense, and to the extent to which the Caspian Sea basin or area is linked or linkable or connectable to India, I think is one that we will discuss. The second point precisely is to suggest that reserves of energies are one thing, but more important than reserves is the export routes from the region where the reserves are. Of course, without reserves, without any resources, the question is quickly to be closed. But with reserves comes the next question, more fundamentally, is the export routes. And there aren't that many routes to export energy from the Caspian Sea area to the rest of the world. One route is the western one, through Georgia and Turkey. The other one is through the north of the sea and Russia and the west, but that route has become bypassed today. The other route, which is east, is from the Caspian Sea area directly to China, through the convenient signal territory of Kazakhstan, to which can be connected to Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. And the other route is basically southeast, and that's the Taipei route in terms of its name, and the route that goes from Turkmenistan to Afghanistan and Pakistan and the Indian Ocean. That route, I don't have time for that now, but explains to me, from the point of view of geopolitics, much of the 2001 plus events and presence in Afghanistan, and the dynamics, which is the most potentially rich today, of whether or not sooner or later the Caspian Sea will be connected to the Indian Ocean in terms of energy exports, and that is our second point. There are, I don't think we can discuss this, but many alternatives to what I've just said. From the Caspian Sea area, it's west through Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey. It's east, north through Russia. It's east through Kazakhstan, and it's southeast through Turkmenistan and Afghanistan. There aren't really alternatives to that, and clearly over the past years, the eastern route has become privileged. That is the route from the Caspian Sea to Kazakhstan to China, in many ways. The third point is that at present we are witnessing a sort of reorganization of the whole continent in terms of pipelines and energy transport. We are witnessing a reorganization which is happening on that scale of the continent, in terms of ambitions, potentials, financing, reshuffling of diplomacies, and so on and so forth. And so when the reshuffling takes place on that magnitude, on that scale, anything becomes possible. Even connecting India to the Caspian Sea becomes manageable, however much it costs, however complex it might be, however technically difficult it is sometimes to build pipelines for certain terrains. When the continent is being reorganized, one particular country, one particular connection is part of a vast scheme. When the issue is that everything is already organized and there is an additional stretch of connectivity that is to be done, in relative terms, it's more complex. When we are looking at the whole continent being reorganized, in its small portions, so to speak, it's more manageable. That's my contention. And my last point is to again suggest, but then we should have another map if you could. I don't know, it's difficult to find a proper map. But a map that would show us, in just one blink of the eye, the distances concerned. And the fact that there are alternatives, or that there are no alternative to certain itineraries and routes. To the question, which is the same as I've asked before, how to go from the Caspian Sea to certain destinations. India is one thing that we should discuss, but there are other questions as well.
It is getting behind if we like go to the camera. No, right? Not visible.
Well, is Google Maps not relevant?
No, we don't want
Maybe not. Okay, right. Well, without a map, the map would make it easier, but we don't need the map because we are. Okay, now some territories are particularly privileged when it comes to the issue of energy exports, and Iran is one. Iran is the ideal territory when it comes to this issue, because it is, first of all, a territory that is a producer of energy, an exporter of energy, located near the Gulf and the ocean with open access, and located in between two major producers that are directly relevant to what I'm discussing, Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan, and it is a linked territory between Asia and the Mediterranean beyond Turkey and the West in general. So that territory, logically, in geopolitical history, has been the center and object of coveting and ambitions and alliances and reversals of alliances. And so we can certainly shed a new light on the pre-1979, post-1979, so on, dynamics. What 1979 means in that regard is the fact that suddenly overnight, the territory and the reserves and the exporting capacity of Iran stopped being addressed to the West and were addressed mainly to the country itself, and gradually over time, as I've explained to you, readdressed to the East. Since now the dates of 2005, observer status of Iran to the SCO, 2021, the membership status, and they start making extra sense in terms of energy access to energy, and in terms of energy exports. Certainly, Iran becomes a nexus or a crossroad or a key actor and a focal point of attention. And so what we should discuss is the way in which this and when this changed fundamentally relations for the things for the Indian energy diplomacy, looking at Iran differently and as a connectivity partner. Because what I hear, what I read is really interesting, that Iran is becoming relevant also as a link territory between Central Asia and the West, which is interesting because it means that the concept of unlocking or de-landlocking or unlocking Central Asia is one that is no longer purely academic. It's one that is becoming practical. And it is interesting also because there is a way in which if you start infrastructuring or equipping over vast distances with railways and roads and other pipelines, the links between Central Asia and the Mediterranean, the links between India and Iran and that part of the world, you reached the comment which I've heard and which surprised me and about which I'm still thinking, that this would be a way for India to connect to Central Asia via Iran, which makes sense, but which is not something that spontaneously we might have thought of 5, 10 years or 20 years ago. And certainly Iran is no longer isolated, but is, on the contrary, turned into a centripetal actor that may change in many ways the logistics of the question. I think this microphone is going to remember me, and
This is fine.
I'm going to...
Yeah. This is the one which we finalized.
Yes.
It's visible.
So in terms of distance, the fact that a link from India to Iran to the West is in fact not far from the connecting link from Central Asia to Iran, in terms of distance, in terms of real geometry, certainly becomes very credible and clear and logical. But in terms of historical geopolitics, this was not a link that would have been thought of as coming easily to mind. So things are changing very fast and very much. Now, whether this is just abstract high diplomacy or whether this is extremely applied and concrete energy connectivity is the question that is opened. So now we can address questions focusing on and restricted to today's topic: energy, the Caspian Sea Basin, India's new priorities, and so on.
Questions and comments? This is decent, right? This is fine. This
Yes.
is what we finalized. You can use the quantity. Yeah.
Yeah, there is a small here. So
Yeah.
so whether by sea or whether by land, to be maritime or not, that is a question to quote somebody else. Anyway, so questions from you? Not on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but on India's energy connectivity. Did some of you attend the October seminar that we had here at this university? Yes. Okay. So we're not total strangers to each other.
No questions? Somebody take a lead? It can be a comment, if not a question.
Disagreement? A rebuff?
Also disagreement? What about you? Please, you must.
On SU's energy, the broader question on SU.
Please.
Yeah, that is what is supposed to be.
Yes, please.
Hello, Professor. My question is that is SU's current structure, the larger institutional framework, is that sufficient to act on making a real energy club that would exist in real world and not on papers, particularly taking in context the non-binding agreements and enforcement mechanism that SU currently have? Second is that should, if not,
This is the first one.
First, I think,
yeah,
yes. The short answer is yes. The moment there exists a formal, diplomatic, institutional, legal sort of framework as a shell, so to speak, or as a container, there is a possibility and also the will to fill in the container with content. And the content is common actions or common priorities, if not common policies, as I've said before. So clearly, whether it is the chicken or the egg, clearly once the institutional framework exists, the participating countries want to adopt and pursue and follow common actions. Now, some of them are security oriented, the fight against terrorism, separatism, and activism, and the military aspects, and some other form of content is development, therefore energy access and energy transports. So clearly it is logical that the concept of an SU energy club should have emerged. It emerged very early on in the years 2004 or 5, and if I'm not mistaken, it is regularly mentioned, and it might one day well happen. This is, I think, a clear trend. That is not the question to me. The question is whether the realization of an SU energy club would be exclusive of exports to non-Shanghai Cooperation space. And that question we cannot answer yet, but it is a potential evolution, which some other authors have called the closing in of the space, because there is still a dependency on macroeconomic revenue. The trend that has been in existence is that in the name of, so to speak, not officially, but implicitly, in the name of the Shanghai Organization solidarity, the prices of energy exported from some members to the other members are kept low. And if they are kept low, it means the revenue of the exporters are also low and perhaps not sufficient for the macroeconomics. So they have to also keep on selling to non-regional actors at a higher price. If you look at Russian oil, the price it's paid at by the Chinese is much, much lower than the price it's paid at by other countries. And incidentally, the issue of limitations on export is bypassed because crude oil is exported and then transformed into refined oil by other countries and then re-exported by them to countries which might not have been willing to import directly from Russia. So that's the first answer. What's your second question?
My second question, Professor, is that how can SU, if SU at all should be concerned about this more renewable sources of energy, and if yes, how can SU manage and mitigate the risk of over-dependence on fossil fuels in an increasingly decarbonized global economy?
That's a very complex question. I'm not sure I have the answer to that. If I see the potential of your question, which you might be aware of yourself or not, actually, but it's a brilliant question because it contains the issue of alternative dependencies. If each country is able to very quickly produce for itself enough renewable energy, then the issue of energy solidarity becomes less relevant. Suppose tomorrow morning all these countries produce enough energy for themselves from wind and sun and so on, then they no longer need to import energies from the rich countries. So China, India are independent, they no longer need so much the oil and gas from Russia or elsewhere. So that might be a way through which solidarities derived from dependencies are suddenly gone. And that would be perhaps a bad news for the cohesion of the construction of the region in the form of the organization. Now we know that it's not tomorrow that renewable energies are going to replace fossil energies, but we might well hypothesize that there will be always a mix of modes of energies because countries will want to keep relations also as exporters-importers. But I don't have the final answer to your question. Are you suggesting that the energy-dependent countries might one day become dependence-free? Are you suggesting that the countries that are within the SCO construction, the countries that are at present energy-dependent upon the producers and exporters, might one day become dependence-free? In other words, self-sufficient. Is that what you're suggesting?
Not really. In near future, it doesn't look like that. Like, if I have to comment on that, I would say that first is we can take a larger global south approach in near future to say that at least for a few years or maybe for a particular period of time, we need to rely on this dependency on non-renewable sources of energy to at least reach to a stage where the levels of development are comparatively less unequal in terms of country-wise. Second is that if we have to reach to a stage of renewable energy at all, SCO might be with very all the hopes that I have in SCO. SCO might be a structure where SCO countries can provide incentives to other SCO countries to, like, in terms of reaching to that particular level of development where from that point of time the SCO countries can be, if not completely self-dependent, maybe more dependent on renewable energy and less dependent on the non-renewable sources of energy which SCO can produce and consume in itself only.
Yeah, there's one element which is very simple that makes energy exports and imports specific. I'm going to say more, and the other point is that the context is one of a vast reorganization of transport grids, and some transport grids can be used to transport any goods, and they are the more relevant to our actual analysis, I think. The thing is that pipelines can only be used for transporting oil and gas. They can't be used for transporting other, it's in science fiction, for transporting other goods. So if they are constructed at present as they are, but the energy, the oil peak is reached one day, they become, what's the word, obsolete or not used anymore. You know, when countries no longer use gas and oil and things, they are not going to use those pipelines. At present, energy transport is not entirely realized by pipelines. In fact, only the minority of energy transport, especially east to west of the continent, is using pipelines. Energy is transported by trucks, by trains, and when it comes to trucks and roads and trains, these are the most relevant mode of transport in terms of the reorganization of the continent, because of course railways and roads and trucks and all the rest can transport any type of goods. So they can be reconverted. Trains and trucks can be reconverted from energy transport to other forms of transport. So this is the vast horizon made up of, perhaps for the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years, a dual emphasis on pipelines and road and rail. And in 50 years' time, maybe the investments in pipelines will be what's the word, rentabilisé, which would the return on investment would have been enough and gone, and the next emphasis would be on road and rail transport. That we don't know. In between those two evolutions, I think the production of energy by renewable sources will be increased, and electric power lines will be built, and therefore they will also be a way to equip the continent lastingly with electric power lines as transport vehicles, but the energy transported produced by renewable energies and not produced by fossil energies. It depends whether we are focusing on 5 years horizon or 50 years horizon or more. And I think if we claim to be ambitious enough to address potential development, we should address the long term. The long term, of course, is a very uncertain horizon, but still, even if we'll be dead, others will pick up from us. But your second question is beyond my capacity, I think, yes.
Any other questions?
Madam.
Good afternoon, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible and visible.
So, despite extensive international sanctions being imposed on Russia due to its action in Ukraine, the Indian-Russian relationship has not only endured but expanded in the last couple of years. So, my question is how India's strategic interest in securing energy connectivity and resources is shaping with Russia, and what's its future in the upcoming 5 years, and how it's going to align with the other global powers in the long run.
Well, two questions, I think, two answers. One is that history shows that the sanction regimes imposed upon this or that actor in the world is never efficient or fully efficient, or certainly not in the long term, because sanctions can be, the consequences can be bypassed. There are always alternative ways to import, export, and this is what the history shows regarding many countries in the world which over the past decades have been facing sanctions. In fact, in some of the books we've done, there are at least two chapters written on that issue. I'm not saying this so that you buy our books, but you can consult them. The ways around the sanctions, which characterize the regime sanctions in the world, and in the present times regarding Russia, that's one example. Now, for India, Russia, and so on, I think any country's key word in terms of energy diplomacy or connectivity diplomacy is diversification. So, as far as I'm concerned, the enhanced Indian-Russian connection over the last few years, or I mean, over the last decade to a few years, including in terms of energy imports, is one extra dimension which is reinforced or reintroduced or developed whichever way, in addition to other Indian partnerships for imports, exports. And Middle East is one, of course, and I'm quite certain that there is also at the same time a development in India for renewable energy sources. And differently from Mongolia and Russia, you have not only the sun and the wind, but you don't have the harsh climatic conditions. You may have other technical challenges for engineers to build windmills and solar panels, but you don't have the temperature gradient that they have. So it's a question of investment, it's a question of time, it's a question of credibility. But for a country with a huge size such as India and others, the extra benefit of renewable energy is that the energy can be located near the consumers, which is not the case for oil and the nuclear energy, or even nuclear plants. There is always a problem of transport of energy, and the crude energy as in oil and gas, or produced energy as in electricity, which can't be transported far. It can, but there are lots of losses of energy at the same time. So I think, to go back to your two questions, first, Russia's exports are still continuing. They are taking other routes, and India is diversifying its imports. And partnerships, and this is the diversification is often a key to success in precisely major post reshuffling of dynamics. If you look at Japan, part of the so-called economic miracle of Japan in the post-Second World War is not only its its activism in work, its determination, its very coherent policies, but the policy of diversification of imports of raw materials and diversification of exports of what's it called, industrial materials. Japan has very cleverly designed and pursued a policy of diversification to the point of being, as you know, but as people sometimes forget, the first country to invest in China on two key occasions: post 1978, the moment China opened, and post 1989, after the sanctions were imposed on China by many countries. Japan was one of the first country in the Western camp, whatever you call it, to reinvest or to renew or to keep investments and to keep partnerships with China after 1989. Thank you for the first question mentioning India. So other questions on India and India's energy policy and India's I know you by face by now, but I don't know whether you are students or colleagues or PhD holders or whatever. It doesn't make any difference to me, but still.
Any other questions?
Compulsory book. Everybody has plastic.
Yeah. Anything that comes to your mind? Yeah, think, please.
You're very polite not to ask me counter questions on Europe, which I'm not here to teach about, but which.
You mentioned about the hypothesis that I'm sure the similar happened with Europe also in the industrial revolution era when the imports. Yeah.
Yes,
And then there was a contraction in the imports again.
Well, what we've done is that when we invented or created the European space or the European market and so on, we of course adopted a free trade regime for member states, and then we made the external tariff, that is tariffs imposed on imports from outside the European space, taxable, and those taxes actually going into the budget of the European Community and the European Union. So in that sense, we opened up to ourselves and we closed in vis-à-vis the rest of the world in many ways. And the concept applies. If it's a concept, it should apply to any real construction. The difference is that opening up and closing in, as the hypothesis for China, cannot apply to the whole of the Shanghai Asia until a totally custom-free regime exists among member states, and that is not the case, except at present for the members of the Eurasian Economic Union. But besides the Eurasian Economic Union, which brings together Kazakhstan, Belarus, Russia, Kyrgyzstan, and I think more recently Armenia and Azerbaijan, unless I'm wrong, Uzbekistan is considering not yet part of it, but there are still custom regimes among other countries members of the Shanghai Cooperation. Now, has Europe opened up and now closed in? I'd have to think to answer more precisely. Perhaps what you are consciously or subconsciously suggesting is whether Europe as an entity, the EU as an actor, which is a concept some dispute, the EU as an actor is also engaging in international trade agreements, either with Latin America or the countries in the world. Recently, there was an agreement signed between the EU and Mercosur, which is making your question more complex, because whether we're talking about Some countries closing in or not, some countries part of the Eurozone only, or some countries of the whole of the EU closing in or not. I have to think more on your question. But the energy question is one that we discuss today. Now for Europe, the energy question is very different from what it is here. We have very few energy producers, essentially Norway and Britain, and both are now out of the EU as such. One never was in, Norway, and one was left recently, the UK. So it means energy is produced outside the EU zone and never in that sense benefited Europe very much. So from the start and all along, European member states have had to find alternative sources of energy, basically the Gulf and North Africa, Algeria for gas. So that hasn't changed very much. That will probably not change. We've come a long way in the production of nuclear energy, but many countries have remained fiercely nuclear free. Sweden in particular, Germany tried or pretended to, but it's now going back at that point. And we are developing renewable energies with different successes. Some countries are very advanced in producing renewable energies, in particular Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and then for some reason in the north of France there are a number of windmills more than in the south, probably because it's close to the Dutch and Belgian examples. So that's our evolution, and that Europe can only hope to, in terms of nuclear dependency or reduced dependency, to operate with nuclear energy and the renewable energy. And hydroelectric energy could be more developed in many of our countries. France in particular could have had a policy of developing more hydroelectric energy. We have sufficient mountains and rivers and streams and so on, but there was a choice made in the 50s and 60s to push development of nuclear energy because the scientific investment for that direction was the same, or to some extent the same, as the development of nuclear arms. And France, for reasons that are the General de Gaulle's reasons, thought that the concept of independence for France required the capacity to be a nuclear power. So there was a political choice. But in terms of geomorphology, France could produce much more energy from hydroelectric and from tidal waves as well, tidal technology, the tapping of tides, at least on the western coast, not on the Mediterranean, but still. So that's my answer for Europe. But back to India, or back to Asia. How much do we know? How much do you know about your government's recent or not so recent or projected efforts to develop nuclear, renewable, and other forms of energy as alternatives or complements to importing of oil and gas?
India has been the victim of
for which I apologize.
No, you don't have to. Yes, you don't have to. Because they're importing gas from Russia, but they're asking India not to do that. Also, on the nuclear issue, India was not made the part of this nuclear club. As a consequence, no Western country could have invested in India in nuclear energy sector. In 2006-07, there was a deal which took place between the United States and India, and after that, some of the restrictions and sanctions were waived. Only then we started having a deal with other countries. France, we have one deal. With the United States, we're going to have in future. But with Russia, we have very good nuclear program, nuclear joint collaboration. So Russia has helped, but otherwise, Japan and no other Western countries actually have invested in the nuclear energy in India. And we were not in position to import uranium and other products from any country, partly because of those restrictions. And so we are, and then Western countries are also saying that you cannot import from Iran, which is the nearest country that we should be importing. We cannot import from Venezuela. We cannot import from Russia. So just imagine the kind of hypocrisy that the Western countries have vis-a-vis the sanctions and the entire energy policy. And now most of what is happening today in terms of energy, that India is importing energy from Russia, in that price cap of $60 per barrel. And then a lot of energy India is exporting to Europe. So what Trump is saying that now we will try to stop that one because because US wants to export energy directly to Europe. America wants to export energy directly to Europe now. So there is a lot of conflict and tension which is taking place at the international level. And India is very clear that on the issue of fertilizer and on the issue of energy import, it will not compromise because people will revolt. Once there is a price rise, people will, no government can sustain even if 2-3 rupees. So that's the challenge with Indian government and decided very smartly not to join the Western side.
Well, I think the modern world is one in which compromises can be imposed on people, on countries. The countries are now free to establish their own alliances and partnerships. You mentioned the day 2006.
The nuclear deal between the United States and India
Yes.
For nuclear cooperation. It's called civil nuclear deal. So military, even today we cannot have, but yeah, in civil areas we can have cooperation with the Western countries. So, but even today India has the sanction imposed by NSG, that group which kind of monitors.
Yeah, I clicked to the date because it's the same date as the Semi-Palatine Treaty by which the Central Asian countries
India
went.
is not remember nuclear supply group. So as a consequence, we cannot import, we cannot export.
Yes, but since 1998, India is a.
No, that's different. Nuclear state testing is different, and this getting uranium from other countries is a completely different issue.
Yes, so you're talking about the access to uranium as a raw material to feed the nuclear industry. But in terms of nuclear capacity, you've been a nuclear state since 1998.
Earlier, Canada was supplying. The United States we also had agreement, but this suddenly stopped.
So my obvious answer to you, which is to me an easy one, maybe it's not a sufficient one, is that now you are, together with Kazakhstan, part of a same organization. Kazakhstan is the highest reserve and production of uranium. So if it means that the contiguity of the territories means that exports, imports of uranium from Kazakhstan should.
The problem there with Kazakhstan is that Kazakhstan is very close to Chinese government, and even there is a competition between India and China on acquiring the hydrocarbon, this what you call the this oil and gas from Kazakhstan. Partly because China does not allow the Kazakhstan government to sign deals with India.
There are always adjustments necessary and in the making, but my point is that before 2017, the situation was one situation, and now it's a different situation because the official charter and policy and practice of SU member states is to facilitate, even privilege, cooperation among the member states. To privilege cooperation, at least in the diplomatic language, means to facilitate export-imports. Now, whether a country is more or less willing or happy to see such or such country cooperate together is one possibility. I said many times, and I will say it again, that members are still competing not against each other, but with each other. They are still trying to have the leadership or the prominence in many ways, and so the Chinese-Russian rivalry is not stopping, certainly because they're members of the same organization. The Chinese-Indian, let's call them, relations are not going to change overnight. The fact that Kazakhstan is trying to play, and it is playing, a sort of role, not a mediator, but an intermediary role between China and Russia is a reality, and China has had a very successful diplomacy for the last decades in that direction, developing actively relations with China. This is absolutely true, maintaining relations with Russia more than other countries in the region, except perhaps for Tajikistan, but Tajikistan is not as strong as Kazakhstan in macroeconomic terms. Therefore, the good relation with Russia for Tajikistan is one that makes Tajikistan able to receive support from Russia in whatever way. But the real stable, constructive relation is Kazakhstan-Russia, at least for the better part of the last 30 years. So rivalry continues, competition continues, disagreements, of course, still exist, but the facilitation of diplomacy relations is, I think, a reality. If we think in terms of facility or difficulty or impossibility of relations between the countries that we've mentioned, things have changed over the past 10, 20, 30, 40 years. and changing, they are going to facilitate even such issues, such delicate issues. In other words, the fact that nuclear cooperation, in the sense, if I understand you correctly, of access to uranium, enriched uranium, is not happening with, as formerly Canada or the USA or Europe, is the case. But to what extent is that affecting the other potential, which is the provision of uranium from a country such as Kazakhstan? Now, enriched uranium is a different question.
Even uranium, the technical part of it. Even the technical issue, the problem is that US, for instance, US wants to establish a few nuclear, energy production center in India. But the problem is that US acquires technology from Japan, and Japan has a very strong nuclear policy that it will not supply to any country which has not signed the nuclear agreement, the international agreement. So as a consequence, even US is not in position to start companies in India because of the Japanese policy. So how do you deal with that? It's a big challenge. As a consequence, we had almost lost one government because of the deal. Because Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister of that time, he said he will sign the deal, or if he doesn't sign, or if India decides not to sign, he'll resign from the government. And we finally succeeded in signing the deal, despite the opposition from the left parties and all. But even today, after almost 20 years, there's not a single nuclear installation supported by US in India. And now, when the Trump government comes to power, we are expecting that something might happen. So,
well, I'm not competent enough to discuss the enriched uranium issue.
uranium also, we cannot.
Yes.
Access to raw material has been denied as a part of policy.
Yes, but okay, I repeat my answer differently. Among member states of the SDO, there are a number, if not a majority, or half of them, are, or many of them, are holders and producers of uranium and also of enriched uranium. So India can import either one of the forms from them.
Now it has been allowed, so we can import, yes.
The history of the world is one also, to some extent, where things that are deemed impossible somehow are not impossible for very long.
I think in India there is a perception that all the nuclear regimes, international regimes which have been created for export-import, it was only to prevent India from becoming a nuclear power.
Yes.
All the deals which have been signed, all of them. It was because of China, US and France and the UK, they collaborated in the Cold War period to prevent India from becoming nuclear.
Yes, so this is the...
France has been, we have better ties with France compared to other countries.
Yeah, I agree. It means that the issue of exports, imports is not neutral. It's an issue to do with dependency, neo-dependency, or policies designed to provide and also make dependent. So in terms of, yes, so we agree on that. We agree on that.
Still thinking.
Still thinking. The thinking will produce a terrible question to which I will not be able to answer. So I ask the impossible question at 1 o'clock, so I can disappear, keeping face. Sorry?
Yes, sir,
One addition to what Rajan said.
Yeah.
Sir, India has started to explore its thorium reserves. So
Sorry?
India, thorium.
Thorium is another used for
Thorium.
Yes, sorry, yes, okay.
So, because we cannot, again, as already sir pointed out, most of the things that is wrong with the current nuclear regime or the exploitation portion.
Maybe you could come a little forward.
Come forward.
Sir, actually, India has started to explore its thorium
Reserve. India and Australia have one of the highest portion of thorium which we can extract. So government have made some amendments in the already existing infrastructure. I think there was a bill in 2023 that has allowed other private sector to extract or check for the reserves that are available here. This is one of because we are
So you are trying to say that
What are the alternatives?
alternatives
Yeah,
to
Of
uranium.
uranium.
Okay. So there are other reserves too.
Yes, yes. I was thinking about this term as I listened to you. I think there are two things which are um, to be considered with a different, very different time factor. In abstract theory or in abstract dynamics, alternatives can always be found and will be found. Sooner or later, alternative to one material, alternative to one resource, alternative to one import route, alternative to one form of production of energy. The question is how soon and how much time will it take? Because day after day, morning after morning is a question of how to provide the day's energy. So whether scientists and geologists and engineers can in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, or even 2 years' time find alternatives, I think is beyond question. The scientists and the human genius has always found alternatives to problems. But how quickly, how does India deal with today's energy needs and tomorrow's energy needs? So there is a time difference, I'm looking for the right word, an overlap, different timescales at play. This is my first answer. My second answer is that interestingly we've gone from a class today devoted to energy in general, to nuclear energy in particular. So, and the reason why is that, as I said to you to this class before, with a word that could be better phrased, there is a particular efficiency of nuclear energy. With a small quantity of fuel, one can produce vast amounts of energy. But what about the question that interests me is the diversification of India's import routes for oil and gas from Saudi Arabia, from the Gulf, from Iran, from other STO countries. How is that changing? So it's my question to you. Am I naive and idealistic in thinking that not overnight, but after 6 years now of membership, the reshuffling or the reorganization of India's import routes has taken place? Or maybe I'm naive, or maybe I'm not realistic.
Sir, at least we have shifted from Iran to a large extent because of when, like during the Trump one presidency in America, the threat of sanctions in general, even though we have not done it till a large extent, but we are moving a little bit away from dependency on Iran because Iran provides.
There is actually zero trade with Iran.
Yeah.
This issue. We are not importing even one bit from Iran because of the sanctions. Yes, but on the issue of Russia, we decided not to join the sanctions because otherwise all the sources would have dried up and we don't have any source. So we are not importing anything from Iran. The major importing the countries that we import: Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Russia. Today, Russia is the largest with 38% of energy import just from Russia. But it's just for the last 2 years. Earlier, it was Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, other Gulf countries, Bahrain, etc., and a little bit from Venezuela also. But now governments of US say that you cannot import from Venezuela also. So that again has become a challenge.
Yes, but what the foreign government can say is not presumably going to be the key factor forever.
Yeah. It is, because the problem with China and India is that in our case, we import through our private companies like Reliance or whatever companies are. But these private companies are, because they are dealing with US, so they will come under secondary sanctions. So just because of fear, they'll not even touch Iran. They'll not touch Venezuela. So it's not the state which is dealing. The state can defy it. When it comes to defense export, we can defy it. But it's done by the private individuals like us, and our children are in the US, our companies are in the US, so we cannot defy the US. That's the real problem.
But
China can do it because China has many shadow government companies.
which route does energy and oil and so on from Russia take to reach India?
Gulf only.
Okay. So I can sense that the question is anticipated. I should have asked the question maybe in 5 years' time. That the extent to which membership of an organization facilitates significantly the imports of certain resources by one country, and I still believe it does, but maybe I'm I'm neglecting some time factors. Okay, I'll have to think more.
Okay, somebody else, please? Maybe on the last. Maybe 2 more questions? Yes,
Madam.
yes.
Sir, out of everything I have like inculcated from this whole seminar, since it is like not much of an interest for energy one, so I've just created a very short and crisp question. Before that, there were a few lines from various articles which I've read is that Turkmenistan is basically there to equip Iran with oil products, petrochemicals, electricity, textile products, and a lot of light industry. So Turkmenistan, yes. So basically, it somehow becomes Iran's strongest partner in Central Asia, for the whole, basically the whole part of Central Asia. But however, with the massive oil and natural gas reserves, Turkmenistan's whole economy is heavily dependent on foreign exchange earnings and from the exports and sale of these resources. And given this, that the country's economic stability is also tied with Ashgabat's foreign policy and the cooperation with its neighbors. So coming to what Iran has to where Iran lies in this picture is basically Iran is always intended to take advantage of its location for oil and gas swaps with the countries of the Caspian Sea and the Central Asia of in the hope of becoming a hub for regional trade centers. So coming to what you posed about the question that will a country be tempted to open an order, tempted to open up in the order to become rich and prosperous, and then one day decide to close and enjoy the richness of its own. So that was also mentioned on like 2 factors, that it should be distant from the rest of the world and it should be self-sufficient to have its own resources. So can we say that even if Iran is somehow dependent on Turkmenistan for a lot of products, but then again that hinders Iran being the hub for regional trade? Because of course even though there are massive oil and energy reserves, but still somehow Turkmenistan still lies in that picture. So can we say hypothetically, even that is actually not practical in this modern world, but can we say hypothetically that Iran being the massive oil and gas producer or reserves having it, so can we say that it can actually go distant from the whole world and actually become a superpower in the next 50 years, I would say?
Major power, you mean?
Resources major power, but right now Turkmenistan, or I would say a lot of other reasons are also there, which is like US based sanctions. So can we say that Iran just one day just disappear from the whole thing and then actually work on becoming a major superpower for energy reserves and oil?
In Iran?
Yeah, Iran.
Iran, yes. But I think my answer would be the simple answer is that we're dealing with 2 different timescales. One time scale is that of politics and sanctions and regimes and fairly short-term pressures, tensions, and so on. And the short term eventually goes. The short term doesn't last, in the sense that what we call sanctions today, history shows us have always gone. Either because the regime changed fundamentally, like South Africa, or whether the authors of the sanctions themselves can no longer sustain their tough stance on the countries in which they have imposed sanctions. In the long term, evolutions take their own course. In the long term, obviously, in the medium term, Iran and Turkmenistan in particular have become each other's pressure valve in terms of sanctions that they have received. Turkmenistan at some point eased out to a little extent in the late 2000s, 2008, 9, 10, so on, the exclusivity it had with Russia in terms of exporting. Turkmenistan exported its gas to Russia. Russia doesn't need gas, but through Russia, Turkmen gas could be exported elsewhere, with imports and exports via Iran. And certainly Iran found itself closed to international trade due to sanctions, and logically it turned to Turkmenistan to facilitate things like this. So in the medium terms, I would call it arrangements which countries can actually find. Neither Iran nor Turkmenistan, in terms of energy, need anything from the world, except selling to the world to derive revenue. In the long term, all these things would be would be gone in the face of a superior, fundamental restructuring of the continent, which is happening, which is underway, and which nothing can stop. If you look back centuries, or not millennia, but I mean the long-term perspective, what is being launched will continue. The metaphor of the super tanker or the super ship, whatever, that sort of just goes on. And what is happening at the present in terms of continental geopolitics is that East Asia, Central Asia, West Asia are reorganizing themselves, restructuring, reforming a power base. That is irresistible in terms of long-term dynamics. And the hypothesis I formed 20 years ago, which was then too anticipated, and which today obviously is still perhaps anticipated, is one by which Eurasian middle powers are forming an arc or a chain of countries that makes sense. And these middle powers are Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Turkey, linking the east of the continent to the west of the continent, in between the giant or super or larger actors, which are Russia and India, China, Russia, and India. It has been the case over the past 20, 30 years that those called middle powers have neither been trapped in dependency dynamics by the other larger countries, nor pursue the course at the expense of the other would-be dominant key actors, but somehow they all have together formed a new entity. The China has emerging as a great power before the end of the Cold War. I really insist on this all the time because China's position is not a consequence of the end of the Cold War. It's just the context has accelerated China's course, decided in '78. Russia as a reinvented state actor, post-Soviet. India, to me, there is the pre-1998 India and the post-1998 India. You seem to be downplaying what happened in 1998 in terms of dependency, nuclear dependency, and so on. We can discuss this. But let's call them, to simplify the vocabulary, the big actors and the medium actors and even the small actors all together are forming a new entity. That is the irresistible, or at least the deep trend, and the rest is contingencies. To call contingencies a regime sanction or a sanction regime is a bit of a bold statement. I agree. To call contingencies border conflicts or even military tensions is a bit of a bold statement. I'm aware of that. But if we accept to have short-term analysis, medium-term analysis, long-term analysis, then we can then I can suggest something worth our reflection. And to finish off, because it's time, but to think of Europe, I mean, first of all, I said, and I stick to my point, that the word Europe has meant something so different over the past decades, and Europe now is accepted as being 26 members, 27 members, whatever, stable entity, a union, and so on, but it was very differently in the past. And if you think of what you've just been said for Asia, countries under sanction, countries isolated, countries dominated, and so on, that's our history. But someone who would have said, in fact, some people said 1,000 years ago, the so-called idea of Europe was launched 1,000 years ago. It was relaunched by philosophers in the Middle Ages and in the modern times. The idea that Europe could be united, but the concept at some point in our history made no sense, was perceived as a joke or as a sheer impossibility before we had nations, before we had post-medieval sort of time. So what is impossible often becomes less impossible. This is my point. But in the short term, what you're saying is more than relevant. In the short term, I'm being extra naive and I'm being extra simplistic. But in middle and long term, we can discuss this. Except that, as Keynes said, I said before, in the long term, we're all dead. So but we can have a post-life dialogue. I think it's time. Yeah.
See you tomorrow. Tomorrow you have to submit your
The student wanted some content.
So please remember to do that. No late submissions. Tomorrow at around this time, one of the volunteers will move around and collect these. So all the best. See you tomorrow. Take care.